Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip 23. This is part 6 of my moisture content series, Blossoms and Backwash. To demonstrate how blossoms and backwash can occur, I'm going to do a simple exercise where I'm going to place 4 washes side by side on this quarter sheet of watercolor paper. I'm working on 140-pound cold press Coral watercolor paper, and I'm using a wash of royal blue. That's a fairly dark valued mixture, and I'm starting with this first wash, and I'm leading the bead of water down the paper as you would when you're doing a flat or gradated wash. And I'm going to change the approach in all 4 of these washes, and you'll see how the different influences of moisture and the timing will affect in the end what this wash looks like and whether or not I get blossoms or backwash. Often when you're applying a wash around various shapes, you have to leave part of your wash with a bead of water and go in other directions and come back and keep leading that bead of water down the page. And as long as you don't let it sit too long, you're okay. But if it sits and the wash that you've laid down ahead of that bead has a chance to start drying, the moisture is going to start to back up and work back up into your initial wash, and it's going to give you blossoms and backwash. So on the left side, that first wash that I've put down, I have my bead of water there, but I'm going to let it sit while I move on to these other columns. And in this second column, you can see that I have the same bead of water. So both washes at this point have a very similar bead of water, and the one on the left has been sitting there longer. Now I'm going to start with the third column, the third wash. So I'm starting to bring that wash down the page just as I did with the others. However, in this one, I don't have quite the bead of water that I had in the other one. So I'm not leaving a bead at the edge as I am on this one. And you can see now I'm starting to lead that bead down a little bit more, and I'm still maintaining a nice consistent wash because the whole wash is still very wet. And on the left, the very first column, it's hard to see right now, but that paper is starting to dry, and little by little it's going to start to wick the water out of that bead of water that I'm letting sit too long. Now on this third column, I'm bringing it down without a bead of water, and I run the risk, if I leave it sit too long, I don't have to let it sit near as long, that edge might start to dry up some, and I'll get some breaks in my wash. The second column, as I lead that down and I recharge that bead, I can continue to let that set, even though the wash at the top of this column that I'm painting right now has probably started to dry. The area closest to the bead of water is still very wet because I'm gradually taking that down the page. On my first column, I haven't moved that bead of water and introduced any more moisture, and that wash that I applied is starting to dry, so it's going to start to pull that moisture out of the bead. And you can already start to see a little bit on this column where it might have started to get a little bit of an edge because I didn't leave a bead of water. On this second column, I've drawn that bead down a little bit more, and now I'm going to recharge it so that I can continue to lead that down the page without getting a hard edge. As long as I have that bead there, that edge is not going to dry. And on the right, that third column, I haven't left a bead there, and that's starting to dry up. So eventually what's going to happen, if I wait too long, I'm going to come back in and start to move that down the page. I'm going to start to get a break in my wash a little bit where it's going to start to show a line, and it won't be a solid wash. Now I'm going back up in the top of this column, and if I were going back up and I thought, oh, I missed a spot, I've waited too long. That paper up on the top has started to dry, but it's still partially wet. And now you can start to see, because I went back in with more moisture, I have an imbalance, and it's going to start to create a blossom up in that area. Now on this second column, you can see I can continue to lead my bead down that page because I'm not waiting too long. I still have time to let it sit there for a while, but come back, recharge it, and bring it down the page and leave another bead of water. And I'm going to get a much more consistent wash in doing that, even though I'm letting it sit for a little bit of time. On the left, on the far left, the very first column, it is starting to pull moisture out of that bead. And you can see, if you look close on that third column, there is a little bit of an edge about 4 brush widths up where I let that sit and dry without a bead of water. So I started to get a bit of an edge. It's hard to see because this is such a dark value, but as long as I leave that bead of water and I'm timely in the way that I bring it down the page, I'll get a nice flat tone or a nice gradation. It'll be a nice continual wash. So I've taken that all the way down the page, and there's times where I've gone away and let it sit, but as long as I don't wait too long, I'll be okay. So now I'm going to start a fourth column, and rather than just paint it as I did in the other columns where I'm bringing the bead down, I'm going to start to paint around the outside and fill it in. This is much of the way that a painter paints the wall in a house. They cut it in and then they fill in the middle. And that's fine with an opaque paint such as wall paint. But with watercolor, what's going to happen is there's no bead of water on those edges, and little by little they're going to start to dry, and it's not going to be consistent. And when I come back to fill that in, I'm going to start to get some hard edges because I'm going to have overlap on the areas where it's dried, and I risk getting some blossoms where it's partially dried. If we take a look at that third column, you can really see that blossom now, where I came back in on a partially dried area with a loaded brush, and the result is I got a big blossom. And also towards the bottom now, you can, as it started to dry more, you can really start to see those edges that started to form because I didn't have a bead of water. Now here on the first column, you can see that's dry at the top. I have my bead there, and it's been pulling that moisture back up, attracting it back up into the wash, and that's going to result in an uneven wash. It's going to give me a blossom or backwash. On this, it's a pretty consistent tone. There's a little bit of variation in it. If I just brought it straight down, it'd have been better, but you can see in this one, because of me going back with a loaded brush on just a partially dry area, what happened, and you can see where some of those edges have started to dry on that third one. They're more defined there because I didn't leave a bead of water. Now, when I go back to this fourth column, some of those edges have certainly dried. And now you can start to see I'm getting different values because I have overlap of a dried wash, and there's no backwash happening yet. And there may not be because it might be pretty well dried, but I can't get a consistent wash because to take that paint to the edge, I start to get dark lines where it's overlapping. If you look at the fourth column, that last area of wash I applied is still partially wet. It hasn't dried all the way. So if I introduce moisture to that, I'm going to start to get a blossom. And you can see by tapping my brush that's loaded with clear water, the result of that. You can see how I'm getting little blossoms where those droplets hit. That wouldn't happen on the second column right there because it's completely dry. In fact, I'd get a different result. If I splattered on that dried column, I'd be able to lift it off and it would leave a mark, but it would be the shape of the drop. It wouldn't spread like a blossom or backwash. So I'm going to demonstrate that. I'm going to paint a block right here in the bottom left corner. I'm going to let it dry, and I'm going to do the same thing with a brush. Just tap it so I get a little bit of splatter of clear water, and you'll see the difference. So I've got my shape there, and I'm going to take a damp brush, and I'm going to lift that bead of water, and then I'm going to dry this. So if I take a damp brush to a bead there, it's going to absorb the moisture in that, and then I'm going to be able to dry it. So just taking a damp brush, and it absorbs up the excess. And now I can dry it. Everything's dry, so now I'm going to sprinkle some water on it with a brush, just as I did at the fourth column. However, you can see that I'm not getting any blossoms going on. That's because that paper was completely dry. But I will still have an impact on the pigment, especially with a darker valued paint like this. After I let that water set just a little bit and I blot it, you can see I get just a little bit of a lift of the paper there. But if I take my tissue and I almost strike the paper kind of sideways, in a sideways motion, it lifts more of that pigment, and you can see the shape that it leaves. It's an effective way to make texture. You pretty much have to do it on a darker value, though it doesn't show up as much on a light valued pigment. If that paper was partially wet, though, I would have got blossoms. Now you can see also on this second column, which has been completely dry for some time, I can come in and put a wash on top of it, and I don't get any backwash because the paper was completely dry. This is why you can glaze with watercolor, and you can build up these layers without getting the blossoms or backwash effect, because you can paint on the dried paper, and it's safe to do that without worrying about uncontrolled backwashes and blossoms. And again, if this were damp, I would be getting marks that would be similar to what's in column 3 and 4. But I can paint around here, suggesting, it's hard to see because I'm painting dark on dark value, but you can see how I can paint around shapes on top of this with a darker value and just start to build subtle changes in value and start to suggest shapes. But I don't have to worry about backwashes or blossoms because the paper was dry. Now, the paper isn't dry everywhere anymore because I've put these washes on, and I've been painting wet on dry, and the shapes hold on paper just as if I were painting on white paper. But now you can see I just went in and put some pigment in a wet area that I just put a wash, and it hasn't dried, so I'm getting a backwash. And if I put it in that other shape, which is completely dry, I don't have any issues because the paper was dry. But going in on that top mark that I made, that square that I kind of blocked off, it's still wet, so now I'm getting a backwash on top of that. This is a good example of why it's so important to have a good understanding of the moisture content in your paper, because the moisture content and the timing of when you introduce more moisture into it is going to determine the end result on your paper or in your painting. The various qualities achieved in this exercise might be desirable in a painting at some point in your process, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But there's also times when they're definitely unwanted and you want to avoid them. By having a good understanding of what to expect under different conditions and timing, you know how to achieve these results when you want them, and you know how to avoid them when you don't want them. And that concludes part 6 of my Begin Watercolor Tips series, Understanding Moisture Content. this has been about blossoms and backwash. I know I had a lot of questions about this, and I hope this has answered some of those or given you some good examples on what to expect. These are certainly not the only conditions under which you'll get blossoms and backwash, but it's a good sampling. Be sure to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor friends and subscribers on Facebook. If you have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rsurowitzart.com, and you can email me with specific questions at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.